got 5 movies this week. 3 brand new releases, 2 of which are quite highly anticipated. One dumbass comedy from a few weeks ago, and an animated Netflix movie that's had a surprising amount of acclaim behind it, which was the main reason I even sought it out. So let's start at the beginning with A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. So this comes from Mario Heller, who did this like right directly off doing Can You Ever Forgive Me with Melissa McCarthy and Richard E. Grant. And this was one of those movies that seemed like almost like it was too good to be true. Like when the very first headline came out that Tom Hanks was going to be playing Mr. Rogers, it was sort of like it was almost like somebody had written more of like an internet fantasy article as opposed to something that was actually going to happen. And then like the more the development happened, the more it was kind of like, oh my god, this movie's actually going to be real and soon. And yeah, and then, we got like an image or two, and then more stuff started coming out, and yeah, it was one of those things that seemed like, it almost seemed like it was maybe going too much on the whole, Tom Hanks is considered one of the most likable people of all time, most definitely in Hollywood, at least, and almost seemed like he was a fit for the role just based on that, because looks-wise and voice-wise, it was kind of like unsure. But as we talked about before, it really comes down to most recently with Eddie Murphy and Dolomite, which was, it almost seems like a better, more heartfelt approach when it's not necessarily just imitation. It's like if they just get the essence of the person enough, it should be there. And how Hanks is pretty much so well known for having a similar essence and known for that for so long that it really does fall into place just about as easily as we would have imagined once you've actually seen the performance itself. And I love the way they start off with pushing aside any of that ever so slight doubt maybe some people had. I know most people were incredibly confident in this decision, but you could see where maybe in some of those aspects I mentioned there could be doubt. But the ingenious decision to literally have the first scene be the intro to the show, where he sings the song and does the whole routine. Where it's one of those cases of, this, like, with this being the absolute starting point, it was, we're starting with this, and either from this point on, we'll decide if you're with Hanks in this role or you're not. There's going to be no other telling factors other than how this scene is pulled off, and how he can do this. And then also to go on that, having the show itself and its style and structure be the way that the movie is structured. Where it's almost like we're watching a nearly 2-hour episode of the show that's surrounding the Matthew Rhys character, the way he introduces him. And that's extremely well done. That's not necessarily an approach I probably would have thought of going into this. And then that also keeps up with the transitions, also being like the toy towns and all that, whenever they're, going from city to city or on a plane or whatever, yeah, there's so many great ideas in exactly how this movie presents what it is it's showing, because there is the whole thing about the movie basically being centered around the Matthew Rhys character, the story that is another one of those things where I had always heard that story about how there was a reporter that was tasked with doing this whole segment on Mr. Rogers, and it was like he went into it cynical, and he was like, well, surely the guy's got dirt on him somehow. Nobody can be like this seemingly perfect. And then he just didn't find anything, and it changed his life. It's like, that's a thing I'd always heard, but I was never quite sure if it was just one of those myths or not. Apparently it was this dude, and it was more or less. I mean, obviously, once again, we're gonna have movie-ified stuff in here. Like I said, if the whole some things don't seem too real thing, we did just have the documentary last year, Once Upon a Time, which was one of the best movies of last year. Which almost seems like it could have made this movie kind of pointless. And I heard Hanks recently say that was even a concern of theirs a little bit. But yeah, it follows its own path enough, and I think centers around the story of the reporter that it doesn't necessarily feel like we're just getting the same, like we're just getting the stuff in the documentary reenacted. And a lot of that stuff, like his Arsenio appearance, or the thing where he does the thing where he fights for more funding, where I know a lot of people considered like that when you see that real video, like on YouTube or in the documentary. It's significantly cut down in the documentary, but still the point gets across. It feels like the climax of a movie, but this movie doesn't really necessarily take the big moments like that. They're all like really sort of personal, and that stuff, the real life stuff that we kind of know, is just shown in like a quick montage of him doing like research, which is, and with Hanks just in place. And even in those moments, it all kind of comes through, even as brief as they are. There's even like the moment where they make him look sort of like the younger version in the black and white days of the show, that still looks, accurate in a sense. But like I said, it's really based more on the essence than anything else. And I heard that Hanks was particularly relieved when he heard that Heller didn't want to do too much to alter his appearance. They just put the wig on him and they did the thing with his eyebrows, and other than that, it's Hanks. But that left him enough to just sort of do the essence thing without going too into the imitation thing, which probably would have cheapened it in a way. But yeah, obviously that doesn't happen here. And this also comes through when I'm talking about, like, they kind of seem to go for a more personal and downplayed approach than any, like, the big, textbook inspirational stuff. And one of the first moments of that is when when Matthew Rhys's character first gets to the show, and there's this moment where he's like where Mr. Rogers is talking to like a sick kid, and he sort of talks him down from being this sort of almost seemingly destructive type kid into the kid like giving in and putting his toys down and hugging him. And it's not a big moment at all. There's no music or anything like that. It's like from the almost distant perspective of the reporter. And playing the scenes up like that, where it feels like we're actually witnessing something that's inspirational like that without feeling like it's being, tampered with or manipulated, is where the real strengths of the movie are. And even in this same scene, where they talk, his staff around the set is like, I think they kind of went into this in the documentary if I remember correctly, where the staff would kind of get a bit cynical also, where it's like, yeah, it's great that he's hanging out with the sick kid and he's doing all this and having these heartfelt moments when the cameras aren't rolling, but at the same time they're here to do a job that's on kind of time constraints, so it gets them a bit like, oh, he's with another sick kid and oh, this is going to take forever. But then that like immediately turns around when he starts filming for the show, and you can just see like their hearts won over all over again, and you can kind of see the staff themselves realize, oh yeah, this is why we do this job, because of this stuff. So, and just little moments like that once again where that's hardly even there. That like what I just mentioned is almost like in the background of this scene. So that's yes, and this isn't to necessarily take away from. Matthew Rhys pretty much being the lead character, cause, like the whole Hanks being in supporting for the awards races, it is about right, and I don't know if people will be put off by that if they don't know that going in, because a really easy criticism I can imagine seeing with this movie, and something that I could still buy if I heard it, is that more people would probably want to see like the Hanks scene is more or less the focus, where in actuality it's not just Matthew Rhys's like life in general, where he's got like a new baby and his wife, and he's trying to do the story thing and trying to make sure life doesn't get in the way of that story. And then there's the side plot with Chris Cooper as like his estranged dad, and he's kind of trying to, well, he's not really trying to mend that, but Cooper's trying to mend it, and it becomes a whole portion of the story. And I can see people saying that that's probably less interesting than a movie like focused on Mr. Rogers to the point that we see him through the whole movie would be. But I actually do think that the story with him and his dad kind of is strong enough for the most part to be kind of a focal point, and the way it ties in to the stuff that Mr. Rogers talks about with him, and the way he kind of tries to get in there just enough to be able to talk him through this, because he can see so easily Reese's problems, even though he's either trying to cover them up or not talk about them at all. And the way he almost like the way we've seen before, Rogers had a way of like sort of almost hypnotizing people into this really comforted state around him, just by him just casually talking to them, even if they were the most shut off of people. But there are some angles that the movie takes that I'm sure we can all appreciate that they're in here. But I do think, because obviously one of the problems would be, like, is it going to just totally completely portray him as a saint without any, portraying any of, like, the difficulties in his life, which really we still hardly know about because he just kind of dealt with them in his own ways and not in a particularly big way. So we get moments like the moments when the reporter starts to think there might be something else to him. So we get scenes like when he's doing Daniel Tiger on the show, and the reporter comes around to behind the curtain and watches Rogers instead of the puppet, and there's something off about it, and it's just the way it is. Like, there's almost something like unhappy inside him in this moment, and I get what they're going for. And then there's moments sprinkled throughout where it's like ways where we see he's struggling internally without saying anything about it. But I almost think in some cases I was thinking maybe they went at that a little too hard. But it's I guess the way they acknowledge it and still being relatively subtle about it, not entirely by any means, would be better than if they just kind of glossed over it and made him seem like totally and completely saintly, especially since we do get a scene when the reporter's talking to his wife and she talks about how he really doesn't like being referred to as a saint because he wanted people to see his own attitude as, like, he didn't want it to seem unattainable, like people couldn't be like him if they thought about him as a saintly sort of thing. So, yeah, all of those are in there, but I do think they went in a little hard on the whole, hey, but he might not be as happy as he seems thing, and some of that is a bit too blatant in the way that they do it. But, yeah, it's still there. It also just feels weird seeing, like, it's almost, I mean, I guess this is kind of what you want out of a movie like this, where it almost seems intrusive to see him talking during a Daniel Tiger scene, because even in, like when he was on talk shows and he would bring the puppets out, the cameraman on the talk show still had the courtesy to zoom in on the puppet and make them the whole frame, sort of like the way the Muppets work. But, yeah, so if that's the kind of thing you want to see, that is totally in there. And there's also stuff that that's really well handled in a way, like talking about how they don't use like the overly manipulative music or anything like that, like you would expect in a movie like this, especially an inspirational movie. Where if you saw the documentary, you might recall a moment where he talks about the 60 seconds of silence to just think about the people who have like really made a difference in your life. And then in the documentary, it's just all the various talking heads in the movie just being silent. And we get a scene like that in this movie also. And I can see people thinking it might be a bit on the nose, given the fact... And I can see it being seen as on the nose, but I can also see it being acclaimed for being one of the most powerful scenes in the movie. Where we actually do take... It's just him and Matthew Rhys at like a table in a diner. And he says, take the 60 seconds of silence and just think about it. And the movie actually does completely stop for 60 seconds and goes into silence. And at some point in this silence, Hanks turns to the camera and just looks at us, the audience, while we do this as well. And yeah, like, and it was, like, both of them were hitting me at the same time. It was like, wow, this is incredibly on the nose, but it's like, you still, like, you can, like the longer it goes and the more they just let it, like the show itself, the more it just lingers on him, even when he's not necessarily doing much of anything at all. The more it lingers there, the more you start to feel it. Like, even if you're not feeling it in the moment, like at the start of it, you think it's too on the nose. They give you enough time to turn around and like, oh, okay, I'm feeling it now, and then we get to the 60 seconds ending. Um, so yeah, like so it even takes the approach of like, even when it's not necessarily doing the reenacting the show itself or their whatever version of the show itself. There are even moments like that in the regular portions of the movie that almost feel like they're in the style of the show in a way, which is a really great way to bring out just the sort of, like I was saying, essence of him in general. Where it goes into the technical aspects even beyond Hanks's performance, getting that to the audience, so that's really well done. But there are moments where I talked about there's some stuff they maybe go a bit too, like maybe a bit too heavy on. There are some moments where the reporter is kind of starting to get like when he's getting like overtaken with the whole story. So there's a whole weird sequence tonally when he's at like a bus station and he thinks he's seeing Mr. Rogers. He starts at a hospital and then he ends up at a bus station and then on a bus because he thinks he's seeing Mr. Rogers. And he might be, he might not be, but it's almost like this sort of, almost like he's seeing him as like a sinister specter of sorts. And it's really, I don't know if that's what they were going for, but that's what I'm saying, where it's like, it just tonally, it felt like really off and sudden and out of place. And that's not the only thing that feels tonally out of place. There are certain of the Chris Cooper scenes where there are a couple of moments here and there where it's like, it just felt like it went in like a totally different direction for a second. As far as like, not just what's happening in the story, but or not even necessarily at all what's happening in the story. But the way that it's like shot and the music and all that is like so, it just felt weird. But those are more or less few and far between. But yeah, I think I was going to talk about Reese's performance earlier, and then I got sidetracked. Yes, he is really good here also, and a really sort of fitting lead, where he's able to do the cynical thing, but the more he comes over, and like just in general his reactions, his very varied reactions to Mr. Rogers are believable anytime he goes from one or the other. And there's also a scene with him and his wife in a park that's just really good. So they could have seemed like really also on that sort of maybe a bit too heavy thing, but I think they found just kind of the right pitch there, and Reese's performance just really took it home, so that's great. So yeah, I think that's probably about it. There's also that weird scene I was talking about where he thinks he might be seeing him also goes into this bizarre dream sequence that it does ultimately reach a profound moment. But yeah, it's kind of a decent little chunk there in the middle where it just feels like it goes off on some totally other tangent. So yeah, which is, I think it's also such a contrast because of how consistent the tone is regardless of those. Like they really stick out in a really weird way. But I'm sure that's a subjective thing. That could just be me. But so yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. So I could say that you could probably say that the whole, starring factor here is seeing Hanks play Mr. Rogers, even if it's not necessarily, it's, well, you see, that's the thing, is when, obviously, towards the end of the movie, the article is going to come out, and I think his wife even directly says, it's about you, but it's about Mr. Rogers also, so it's like, it is about him, but it's mostly about you, but it all makes sense. And it's like she's basically explaining the movie and the way they put it together. So, yeah, so like I said, maybe some people will be disappointed that it's not a strictly Mr. Rogers movie per se, but yeah, that's the complicated thing, is it kind of still is anyway, regardless of how much focus is put on the reporter, but Yeah, so apart from, you know, some weird tonal shifts here and there, they had a really good grasp on this, and I think Hanks as Mr. Rogers came out about as well as anybody could have imagined, and those hopes were pretty high. But I think they accomplished that quite well. So we'll see how he does throughout the award season now. There's very stiff competition in that category, but I'm really excited to see. So um, let's go on to Frozen 2, I guess. This was kind of... I wasn't really sure how I was going to take to this really at all. Because as I've mentioned before, particularly in my... when I did the Lion King versus the Jungle Book video, where I talked about how the first Frozen is a movie that I pretty much just have no connection with whatsoever. Even when it first came out 6 years ago, and I did this type of video for it, if I remember correctly, I really had nothing to say back then either. And then I've seen it a few times in that 6 years, like mainly around Christmas and stuff, and I just have no feelings towards that movie. I have nothing to say about it, really good or bad. It just kind of exists. And that is a shame, because when I see all the hype surrounding it and how crazy people are going for it, it reminds me of the animated Disney movies that people went totally insane for when I was like around the target age. Well, I guess with these movies there are a number of target ages, but like the kind of 5 to sort of 9 area. But yeah, I don't know, I just try with these movies, but I just don't really get anywhere emotionally or in any particular like engaging factor just isn't there at all. So I just had no idea how I was going to feel about this. And so going on that, and I was trying to be, because it's not like I'm against these movies, so I didn't necessarily go into it going, oh, well, this is going to be a drag. But I guess I just had no expectations at all. And to their credit, it does feel like this could have felt like, you know, some sort of cash grab or whatever. But it doesn't really feel like that. Like this, like, there are a lot of cases where sequels actually come out, quite a few, theatrically, and they feel like they very well could have just been straight-to-DVD sequels. Which, in most cases, not all, but in most cases is not a compliment. But this one does feel like they did have ideas behind it that made it worth making for them, and there is, surprisingly, almost shockingly, the songs don't feel phoned in at all either. There's one, I think it's Show Yourself, does more or less feel like a reprise of Let It Go, more or less. Up to the imagery and everything. And there's actually even a moment like right after that song where we do hear Let It Go for like a second in another context, so it's almost kind of like they knew. But yeah, there is kind of a strong start here where we do have, you know, a flashback with them and their parents, and we get more on that backstory, and how that whole thing is actually takes us into the story of this one. Even to the point where we get like the sort of almost Tarantino-like, weirdly enough, flashback within the flashback that gets us to this point and introduces this whole other land, this enchanted forest, where it's kind of taking us, like, if there's one thing that you kind of want in a sequel, it's to like have the same feel, but not necessarily be exactly the same thing. So the idea of completely changing the backdrop from like winter and snow and ice into a more like autumn-like scenario is much more, yeah, appealing in itself. So, but as far as like the character interactions and all that, like of course when it starts off and we see them as kids again, one of my concerns about the first movie was the young version of Anna is like disgustingly cutesy. It's annoyingly cutesy. And she hasn't changed at all, so good for her. But yeah, we do get this whole backstory with the parents and how they connected to this whole thing and the mystery surrounding how the potential origin of Elsa's powers and all that other stuff. So yeah, they did have ideas to like expand and not necessarily just do the same thing. So that is commendable, but yeah, and it is funny in a lot of cases. There is a running joke involving Kristoff desperately trying to propose, and it's always going awry in various ways. There is Olaf was like the one character that did stand out to me. Like in any other case, he might be the annoying sidekick, but no, he's far and away my favorite character from the last movie and this one as well. And a lot of scenes that sort of felt like instant classics, like him basically recapping the entire movie all the way up to the events in the movie we are at that time. Um, there is one moment where I know a criticism that was common for the first movie was a lot of people didn't care for like the rock trolls or whatever they are, and there's actually a moment where Olaf kind of calls them out in a way and makes fun of them, and it's like at first it was like, oh, the sort of self-awareness there, and it's like how they actually made fun of what's considered to be one of the weakest aspects of the previous movie. But then like 5 minutes later they're back in the movie. It's brief, but it's there. Like it's like every time it seems like it's either calling itself out or falling on some sort of crutch that it once had from the previous movie. The thing appears. That's like a weirdly common thing apparently. But yeah, Olaf is still just as great as he was before without them running any jokes into the ground. So far as there's even a point in time where Olaf can just make saying the name Samantha hilarious in context. So yeah, and then they add different sort of creatures throughout it. There's a particularly nice scene with a lizard that's like a fire creature, and a little back and forth that he and Elsa have where she's able to, yeah, she like corners him, and then the exchange there is nice, and it does it without dialogue, which I think is kind of the strongest aspect of that. So, and there's a lot of that where they don't there's a lot of nice moments in this movie that don't require dialogue at all, and just kind of stand on the imagery and what's happening alone, just all speaking for itself, which is nice. And there is a water horse that Elsa has in the like sort of the second half, where there's definitely I think a lot more memorable imagery in this one. It's certainly much more like has the more magical feel than anything I can really remember outside of the Let It Go sequence from the first movie. But yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of things here that they expand on and make bigger and make better. And I would say, it's probably kind of early to say this, but I don't know when I'd ever be able to really compare these, but I felt like I do like this one better, particularly in the way it expands on itself and adds the new sort of creatures and designs and all that. But I don't know, there's just still something about, I guess it's just these characters in general and the storylines that I just have this empty sort of non-connection to that I can't really explain. Like it's so hard for me apparently to feel anything for these Frozen movies. So, and I have always wondered, like if this was a movie that the first one particularly, was a movie that came out exactly as it is, when I was like in that 5 to 9 area or whatever, if I would have a connection to it with then, but I honestly don't know. So yeah, so once again, I don't really have much to say about this, or any of these. I don't know how long I've been rambling about this one, trying to come to a conclusion, but yeah, that's the best I can really do. Yeah, but the new songs like Into the Unknown and stuff like that are really good additions. So, and probably a bit more, in some cases, memorable than the previous songs, which is kind of hard to say right now because the other one's been around for 6 years. Like the only ones I can think of off the top of my head in the other one are Let It Go and Olaf's song, and maybe one more. But yeah, so. Yeah, I do think I might prefer this one slightly, but you see the perspective that's coming from, so take that for what you will. I'm sure this review is useful to fucking nobody. but there it is anyway. For completion's sake. So let's go on to 21 Bridges. A movie that I was actually really excited for, even if it didn't necessarily have much, buzz or particular excitement around it. But I've been a massive fan of Chadwick Boseman since Get On Up. And really, you can throw 42 in there also. And then obviously I'm an enormous fan of Black Panther, and so it's like, yeah, just about anything he does, I'll gladly check it out. And in a kind of cool looking crime movie like this, definitely bring this on for sure. So, and the concept behind it was quite interesting as well. So I went into it pretty hyped as it is, just based on the outline of all this. And then the very first scene is Chadwick Boseman's character as a child at his father's funeral, a very well shot funeral. And then that fast forwards us to this whole thing that his dad was a cop who was killed in the line of duty, so he becomes a cop, and because of what happened to his dad, he just has like this inherent vengeful quality to him in regards to seeking crime out. To the point that when we see him as an adult, he is being questioned, like, he's being questioned basically if he's fit for his job, because he has an affinity for killing people on the job. It just, with him in particular, it seems to come to that a lot. So they're taking that into question. And that's basically the way his character is built up. They even call him a trigger, because his affinity for shooting people. And there's a line right after that where he's like, if you're going to call me a trigger, you better have perfect diction. So lines like that really set up his character really well. And there's, in the start of it, knowing what the plot is going to be more or less, or at least the outline of it, one of the first things we see is, yes, we're in Manhattan, and then it gives us the time. Like 5:25 p.m., like exactly. And it's like, usually when you get the time at the very start of a movie, especially like this, it builds up that we're going to get something really tense that's in like a really sort of condensed time frame that's going to make everything feel very quick and very sort of snappy in the way it goes about it. Probably a lot of suspense with a sort of, basically most of it taking place within this one night. And then once a bunch of cops are killed by Taylor Kitsch and Stephen James, I believe, from If Beale Street Could Talk, J.K. Simmons comes in and says, there is all these cops have been killed, and their families are going to have to go through all the trials and all the hearings, and that could take decades. So it's like, why don't we just between us, why don't we make sure they don't have to go through that, if you know what I mean? And that's the setup. And it's like, there's so much here that is so incredibly promising, that's really setting up this really badass, this really, taut, intense, and in this tight time frame, it's like timeline and storyline. How could this possibly go wrong? And of course you got Chadwick Boseman playing this really tough, badass character. And then, it kind of just cuts it off from there and becomes a very generic crime movie from then on. Almost like an almost prolonged Law and Order episode, the way they go from sort of one place to the other and one person to the other. Despite the fact that we as an audience know exactly what's going on because it's going back and forth. And yeah, so it does have moments here and there of like suspense. Like there's one particular moment of great anticipation where when the scene is already tense enough, a phone starts ringing, and it's like just with that anticipation of a continuous phone ring kind of sets the tone for that, and this even further anticipation while we're waiting for this particular whatever to happen. So every now and then we have scenes like that, but for the entire first hour, not really. After all that build-up for the characters, it's and the motivations and all that, and how much could be happening in this little bit of time frame, It's not really. Like, everything just feels really generic and a bit too simple, despite how many different characters keep coming in and out of it. Because we do start with Taylor Kitsch and Stephen James, but there's kind of a ladder of villains. But it's like you would think in a sort of story like this, we would get maybe more sort of colorful and animated characters as we go further and further up a villain ladder. But no, they're just sort of basic dudes. One of them wears a robe, and the other is just a normal guy. That's as creative as we get with these characters, and it's like they're trying to do it. It feels a lot like an Antoine Fuqua movie, where it's like it feels sort of gritty and it's in this, you know, sort of grounded world, but it always feels like it's just on the cusp of breaking out into over the top, but just kind of never quite does it, at least in any particularly effective way. Every now and then there's a moment where something like violent happens that will, like, I could feel like my eyes raising for a second because it was kind of surprising just how brutal it could be from time to time, but yeah, those are way few and far between, and most of them are like in the last third. So that's like an entire hour where it just kind of feels like we're not necessarily going in circles, because we are getting from place to place, but that's about all it is. Like, on the most surface level, is going from place to place. So, yeah. And you would think with this concept, particularly with seeing the times throughout, that, and because it's, you know, Manhattan, but given the concept of everything being shut off and being on lockdown, you would think there'd be this sort of awesome mix of claustrophobia, but also feeling massive at the same time. Sort of like making Manhattan this sort of violent playground for the events of this movie, is what it feels like the setup was going for. But you never really get much of a vibe. Like, it finds too much of a middle ground. It never feels massive, but it never feels claustrophobic either. Almost to the point that it renders the whole concept in general, like, practically meaningless. Especially since there's so many things here where it's like, you could tell, instead of it seeming like these are the actions that the characters would do and what they feel is the right motivation, is basically just the script saying, hey, you need to, like, stay in this particular place so that this thing can happen. Just because it's written, and that's about it. So we can have this generic action scene, and then this one, and then that one, and then it goes into whatever directions it does with this plot with, like, hard drives or something that just kind of comes into it suddenly. And it's like the more they tried to do with it, the more it kind of sucked any of the tension out of it. It needs a lot more of those suspenseful moments and, like, those showdown moments that we get a lot of. And like I said, it feels like with this concept that could have been like a non-stop thing. Like, you think, oh, well, you know, they have to do this sort of build-up thing and this sort of build-up thing, and then we have the explosive stuff in the last third. But we get enough setup, as you heard, to where by the time it's been on for 20 minutes, we don't need any more setup. It's time to fucking do what we're here to do, and it just kind of like, it's almost like it kind of dicks off a little bit, and then action eventually starts to happen, and that's where the movie's strongest aspects are, but it takes its sweet-ass time, and the ways that it gets there often feel pretty convoluted and scripted. So, yeah, that's... So yeah, I say it's like a Fuqua movie. I'm wondering what Fuqua could have done with this. But he's also kind of hit and miss, so that's kind of hard to say. This would have... I could see him making this movie, and it would probably look pretty similar to the way it does now. So, yeah, but it does have an extremely promising start, with two very promising antagonists and promising characters. But... yeah, J.K. Simmons is just background noise for most of it, and he was one of the things that excited me about it. But yeah, so that is a letdown, but I suppose it could have been a lot worse. Though maybe it could have been if there weren't so many aspects that I just already like, just in general, that went into the whole thing. But For the most part, it is kind of a bit of a letdown, so that is a bummer. So, let's go on to Playing with Fire. Another case of another continuing thing of John Cena being in a lot of like kid-oriented things. I think he does like a lot of Nickelodeon shit now, and this kind of falls right into that. So it's an interesting cast, which I first saw in a standee in a lobby, where it's him, Keegan-Michael Key, and John Leguizamo, and to an extent Tyler Mane, he was Sabretooth in the first X-Men movie, and I believe he's Rob Zombie's Michael Myers. So he's here to do the gentle giant thing. And it's pretty much exactly as advertised. Like, you don't even need to see a trailer or a commercial. You look at a poster, and you know everything you need to know about this movie. And it's just right there. Which, to their credit, is more or less like the people that want their entire movie to be on a poster is pretty much the type of people this movie was made for. So, there is that. It is one of those movies where, like, I just want to, like, really tear it down and, like, hail it one of the worst fucking things ever, but it's like, you gotta know what this is already going into it, so it's like, what can I really say that wasn't already expected of it in one way or the other? Well, yeah, we'll get into everything. So when it starts off, we do have the three of them and their whole crew fighting fires and all that. And we get these little comedic moments, of course, where Leguizamo accidentally gets, covered in the stuff, the red dust that puts the fires out, and then there is the joke where John Cena goes back up into the helicopter, and a married woman is on the ground saying, "Please take me with you," and it pans over to her husband. So jokes like that, but then you can see immediately how much it's going to waste the talent involved here, particularly with Keegan-Michael Key and John Leguizamo, because it's like, once you see enough of, John Leguizamo's unleashed stuff, it's like, you can just sense in movies like this just how held back he is, and how much they're just taking away everything that's great about him, and he's just like basically a shell of himself in movies like this, where he doesn't have much to do, because this is hardly his area of expertise. And you've got Keegan-Michael Key, who we know is as incredibly, amazingly funny and talented as he is. And his first big joke in the movie is that he can't get a picture to stay untilted. He can't get it straight. And then, get this, the final punchline, he gets a splinter while he's doing it. And that's Keegan-Michael Key's first joke in the movie. And we linger on it for a while, like most of the jokes in this movie, as you can probably imagine. So we go on this whole, basically, daddy daycare bullshit with the three of them. Yeah, there's even three of them, just like daddy daycare, so... but this movie is an insult to daddy daycare. Like, daddy daycare, in my opinion, has its merits, and can be very funny. I don't know how alone I am in that, but I believe it wholeheartedly. And movies like this are an absolute insult to it, and make it look really even worse than it probably does to most people. So every now and then they throw in some sort of meta joke, like how I talked about Tyler Mane having played Sabretooth in the first X-Men movie. One of the lines he says to him is, "Hey man, you can do this. I've seen you wrestle a Wolverine." And then they do add other characters, like Dennis Haysbert as, like, the superior, that has his moments. There's, like, a phone call towards the beginning that's kind of funny, where every time... He's like the Frankie Four Fingers of, like, this fire department, where every time we cut back to him in the phone call, he's doing something different. And that's about as good as it gets, quite honestly. There is a physical gag involving John Cena in a bed that collapses, which is, completely obvious slapstick that would just, like, be in a movie like this. But it's every now and then there's a guilty laugh like that. But for the most part, it's just all of them dicking around, and you can tell a lot of it was just them filming the cast, just probably on their fucking breaks. because there's a lot of montages of them playing games with the kids. There's dancing scenes, because of course there is. Then there's even scenes eventually where I think this is on the posters and shit also. Yeah, so eventually there's like a room covered in bubbles and they're all fucking around in that. And it's like that the whole room full of bubbles thing. This started with what, Mr. Mom, maybe if not farther back. And it's like I thought that finally went out in like the early 2000s. Like shit like C Spot Run, I thought killed movies like this a long time ago. But every now and then they resurrect from the dead and manage to find reasonable casts. And this is what we get. But then you talk about the jokes that go on and on and on. Yes, eventually we find our way into a shit joke. But let's keep using Daddy Daycare as an example. Since I will defend Daddy Daycare till the death. Yeah, obviously there's a shit joke in that too. But nothing is necessarily seen, and the entire comedy of the scene comes from Eddie Murphy himself. Whereas this is a movie that will not let you get away from this shit joke until after it's been stretched out and stretched out and stretched out enough. Still, eventually, just when you think the whole joke is finally going to reach an end and be merciful, only then, at the last minute, does it turn into a visual gag. And I think that's the difference in sort of gross out humor, especially in movies like this, where it's like, and maybe I'm overreacting to a shit joke, but I feel like it sort of propelled this movie into another area where there is a moment where this is like easygoing viewing for a particular audience there. Where it's like, even if you're watching it as like, guilty viewing, like it may not be anything that particularly appeals to you or that you find specifically funny, but I mean, if it's on TV and you're looking at it, it's not killing you. But it's only in this moment where the shit joke becomes a visual gag that it turns into, well, this isn't hurting anybody, to practically an assault. And then it's like, that you took it that far, and still the joke wasn't over. I swear this is like a whole 5-minute chunk of the movie. And being this movie's an hour and a half, 5 minutes is a long time for a goddamn shit joke. And here we are. And that there's different fucking layers to it. Where it starts off as one joke that they could have left it on, and then it keeps going, and then you think it's going to another scene, and the shit joke is still going, and then it eventually gets to its payoff, and still won't end. And that's one joke that's wrong with this. And yeah, and it eventually gets to a point where they're slipping around in oil for a reason I don't even fucking remember. And that just goes on and on and on. And yeah, this basically shows you where the movie stands or doesn't stand, because they're fucking slipping around and shit, whatever. So, yeah, and then it just kind of gives up on anything at all when it goes full... Yeah, it gives up so much, everything I just said, this eventually just turns into a flat-out love story. Like, you know how eventually, in most movies, particularly shitty movies, it's like, we really don't know what else to do, so we'll throw a love story in it, to put conflict somewhere. But instead of it just being this background thing, it eventually becomes, like, the main objective is to hook him up with Judy Greer and use the kids to do so. So that's amazingly boring in a movie that was already testing our patience as it is, because this whole turn happens fucking late. But that's where I think you can tell it wasn't necessarily a planned plot point. They just fucking gave up. They had the Judy Greer character here, and it was like, oh yeah, I used to, like, date her or whatever. We almost dated once or some shit. And it's like, oh, I guess something will eventually come of that, but maybe in the background for a few seconds. And it's like, nope, the entire last third of the movie or so. But obviously they throw in many other conflicts, but kind of all at the last minute. There is one moment, to the movie's credit, where there's kind of a surprisingly dark revelation. Dark's probably a strong word, but for this movie, it's kind of a revelation that changes things, like halfway through the movie. But then it just goes right back into we don't give a fuck, and neither should you. The way of making that. So, and then eventually we get to this idiotic climax. Like I said, child services gets involved and all the other shit, but it's like, this is all in the last 10 minutes. It's all very last minute, these little conflicts. Dennis Haysbert shows up again, and it's like, oh, John Cena, what are you doing? You've turned this department into this playground, or whatever the fuck he was saying. And it's a birthday party for the little girl, and it's like, this movie's climax is so idiotic. We somehow end up at child services and Dennis Haysbert showing up at this birthday party. Somehow ends up at the main characters dangling off of a cliff. I don't know, that should have been where the movie ended, just off the cliff, you know, in the rolling credits. Even with the gag reel intact. But no, we have to get the whole, he pulls them to safety because we needed something to get children excited for 30 seconds to call it a climax or whatever. So yeah, there's that. And yeah, that's basically what it is. It's one of those movies where you can tell they were really setting out, you know, to make something innocent and playful, more or less, and sometimes that you can just dismiss it as that. It's like they're not really hurting anybody, but it's like, you know, this is one of those movies where you can just sense the laziness in it, and that they just end up, like, they go beyond the point they were trying to do, and instead of making something that you can just dismiss as harmless, is just actual shit. In many cases in this movie, literally, so yeah, there that is. So let's end on a significantly more mature movie aimed at children. Klaus, which is the animated movie that Netflix put out that's basically being promoted as a Santa origin story. Which probably sounds possibly a bit boring on the surface before you actually see it. But it's the way it sort of eases into that concept. That's like there's more to it, a lot more to it actually than just that. And like I said, the way all the different characters and the way everything manages to fall into place, that this is where the story ends up is what's so interesting about it, and draws you in. So the main character is actually this this spoiled kid with a rich dad who sends him off by boat to this land that's pretty much almost entirely off the map, and it's like covered in fog and clouds, and it's just this really dreary, gray-looking place, where he is there to be a mailman. Where no mail has been delivered here for God knows how long, because it's just these people, and all these people do is there's two different sides and they all just feud with each other in very fun and interesting ways. And he's just eventually caught in the middle of this until he finds an off-the-map portion of this practically off-the-map place, where he finds Klaus, who is the sort of gentle giant type, voiced by J.K. Simmons, perfectly cast, as well as Jason Schwartzman. Schwartzman has this like area of expertise where it's like this way of playing characters that should absolutely totally be unlikable, and then makes them like extremely engaging. That's like his forte. That's like his thing. So the whole cast here is really great. We've also got Joan Cusack on one of the opposing sides of this feud. Rashida Jones plays a teacher in a role that's pretty wasted throughout, but still a very strong cast regardless. So before we even go into the whole Christmas aspect of it, a lot of the movie is just focused on this feud, and that in itself is interesting enough to sort of keep this movie afloat before we're even getting necessarily to the point, if you want to call it that. And I think that's kind of a really strong place to start to show that this place, as dreary as it looks, through its characters and the way the animation is, makes it interesting enough as the story goes on, and the way we're going to actually see the town develop just as much as any character would as it goes on. And yeah, the animation is something that does really stand out about it, where it's like, and it's both in the animation and the style of humor that make the movie itself just feel like really old fashioned in general, which I think it should appeal to a lot of people, especially since this whole, the way computer animation looks now, and like the DreamWorks and the Pixar and the Disney animation movies and stuff like that. While many of those movies are still extremely good looking, it's really nice to just kind of get another dose of this, like the more traditional looking animation, to kind of throw a wrench in the sometimes monotony of those other animated movies, which is really definitely welcome here. And the way it really like embraces like the limitlessness of being animated, where like a lot of the details, and where it's like it's able to do that, like embrace that, but not necessarily take it too over the top. But you can see where like there's a middle ground there that they find, that's really nice, where it's like they're not trying to be necessarily like it feels very much like a different like fantasy world, without grounding itself too much, where it feels like it gives itself its own sort of atmosphere and tone, just the way that it looks, and the way the animation is and the detail. And then obviously the relationship between the two of them, the mailman and Klaus, that is eventually the core of this movie and takes us into the other side of it, where Christmas is basically, birthed in a sense, at least as far as the not just the Santa origin story, but the whole kids getting presents and the reindeer and all, just pretty much down to everything. And it's the way they sort of work all of that stuff in that makes it feel, like I said, engaging in regards to a concept that might seem a bit played out, when you just hear, a summary or whatever. And the relationship between them and the way that works, where it's like both of them have similar personality traits, where it's like they have like distant and alienating personalities, but it is where those are coming from that do feel different. Like, while we do see the Jason Schwartzman character does kind of have like an Emperor's New Groove sort of arc. Obviously Klaus also has a very, it's obviously very expected backstory, but also that doesn't necessarily change how genuinely heartfelt it is also when we actually see it. So there's that. And it does fall on some other recognizable things, like the whole, because this all starts with, the mailman being deceitful to the town, and basically doing this for his own benefit, because it's like he has them send letters to Santa, but that gives him a job and gets him paid, to be able to just take their letters and in exchange give them shit, give them presents of sorts. But really he's just sort of profiting off of them and using them. Yes, eventually we're going to get the conflict scene where whenever you have a main character that's lying and using the other characters, that lie will eventually be revealed, and go in predictable directions from there. And like I said, some characters that should be major, like the Rashida Jones character, the teacher, just feel like they're barely there at all, and then like when they kind of show up at the end and they're suddenly important, it's like, where the hell does this come from? But yeah, but that's most of that stuff, is hardly, like, it's way outweighed by the stuff that works, and the stuff that really puts forth its message and the whole angle of it. So we were just talking about how we're often denied actual legitimate Christmas movies anymore. They're actually, worth watching and worth returning to. This might actually finally be one of those. It's the first one I feel like we've had for a while. So, yes. So that's obviously worth checking out, which just about anybody can do because Netflix put it out. So I think that's going to be it for this. Next week is incredibly exciting. We're going to talk about The Irishman and Knives Out. And predictably, our theater did not get Queen and Slim. But we will have, obviously, The Irishman is being put on Netflix on Wednesday, and I'll be seeing Knives Out the same day. So that's definitely something I'm greatly looking forward to. And then I'm going to try to throw some verses out there now that I've gotten behind again. So, yeah, so all of that stuff leading into December's already almost here, and then we'll figure out what we're doing from there. And a awards prediction video, I believe wants to do on the 30th, the very last day of the month. So if nothing changes, that'll be that. So until all that stuff, I think that's it for the